There is a moment in every soldier's life when the mission ends, but the war does not. It follows them home in the silence between heartbeats, in the way they scan every room before sitting down, in the way their hands never fully unclench even when they are supposed to be at rest. But what happens when a warrior comes home and finds that the greatest battle was never overseas? What happens when the enemy is time itself, and the casualty is a woman they once loved? Now reduced to a ghost sleeping beneath a bridge in the same city where she once raised her children with dignity and fire? This is not a story about weakness. This is a story about what happens when two broken things find each other and decide, against every odds stacked against them, to become whole again. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dade had survived 4 deployments, 2 gunshot wounds, 1 classified operation that still visits him in his sleep, and the kind of loneliness that only a combat veteran truly understands. He came home with his military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Atlas, expecting nothing more than silence and healing. What he found instead changed everything he thought he knew about sacrifice, family, and the cost of service. And here is the question that will stay with you long after this story ends. When someone gives everything for their country, who is responsible for what they leave behind? Tell us what you think in the comments, because the answer matters more than most people realize. Marcus Dade had not planned to stop at the underpass on Hargrove Street. He had been walking Atlas through the post-dawn quiet of Richmond, Virginia, the leash loose in his grip, his breath visible in the November cold. His mind doing what veteran minds do in the early hours, cycling through fragments of things he could not change and would never fully forget. Atlas moved beside him with that fluid, muscular confidence that only working dogs carry, his ears rotating like antennae picking up frequencies that human senses could not register. It was Atlas who stopped first. The dog planted all 4 paws and lifted his nose toward the concrete shadow beneath the bridge overpass, and Marcus, who had learned years ago to trust that animal's instincts more than most humans he had known, stopped too. She was curled beneath a gray military surplus blanket that looked like it had once been someone's emergency kit, her back pressed against the graffiti-covered support pillar, her shoes tied together and tucked beneath her head as a makeshift pillow. There was a precision to it, a practiced survival arrangement that told Marcus immediately that this was not someone's first night outside. Whoever this woman was, she had been living this way long enough to develop a system. He had seen that kind of methodical desperation in forward operating bases, in refugee camps. In the eyes of people who had been surviving rather than living for so long that the two had become indistinguishable. Marcus stood there for longer than he probably should have. He was not a man who operated on impulse. 22 years in the Navy, 16 of those as a SEAL, had trained every impulse out of him and replaced it with deliberate assessment. He assessed the situation the way he assessed every situation: threat level, resource availability, mission parameters. There was no threat. The woman was sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady. The resource available was himself. And the mission, though unassigned and unofficial, was the kind that does not require orders because it speaks directly to something older than rank or protocol. He tied Atlas to a nearby pole, unzipped his jacket, and crouched down a few feet away. He did not reach out and touch her. He had enough sense and enough respect for human dignity to wait. When she finally stirred, her eyes opened with the sudden, animal alertness of someone accustomed to danger in sleep. She scrambled backward instinctively, and Marcus raised both hands slowly, palms open, the universal signal of no threat. The same gesture he had used in villages overseas when he needed frightened civilians to understand that he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice trained for calm under pressure. "My dog found you. He doesn't let me walk past people who need help." The woman stared at him. Her face was weathered but not old, her eyes dark and sharp despite the confusion of sudden waking. There were traces of something in her face that Marcus could not immediately name, a structure to her jawline, a steadiness behind her eyes even in fear, that felt oddly familiar in a way he could not place. She looked at Atlas, who was watching from the pole with his ears forward and his tail making slow, deliberate sweeps. "What kind of dog is that?" she asked. Her voice was rough with cold and disuse, but it was measured, educated. It did not match the blanket or the bridge. "Belgian Malinois," Marcus said. His name is Atlas. He's retired military, same as me. She looked at Marcus, then with something that shifted behind her eyes, some flicker of recognition or recalibration, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she pulled the blanket tighter and said, I don't take charity. Marcus almost smiled. Neither do I, he said. But I do take breakfast. There's a diner 2 blocks from here. Atlas is allowed on the patio. You're welcome to join us. No conditions, no expectations. She did not say yes immediately. People who have been on the street long enough learn that nothing is ever truly without conditions. But she looked at Atlas again, and something in the dog's calm, steady presence seemed to reach her in a way that words could not. She nodded once, slowly, and began to fold her blanket with a care and neatness that Marcus recognized as the kind that comes from military training. He noticed. He filed it away. He said nothing yet. Her name was Renata Okafor, and she had once been a United States Army Staff Sergeant with 11 years of service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and a combat action badge she no longer wore because the jacket that once held it had been sold at a pawn shop on a Tuesday morning 18 months ago, when rent and insulin could not coexist in the same bank account. She told Marcus none of this at the diner. She ordered black coffee and eggs and ate with the controlled efficiency of someone who had learned not to trust the permanence of a meal. She watched the exits. She kept her back to the wall. Marcus did the same thing from force of habit, and when they both reached for chairs that faced the door simultaneously, she noticed, and something passed between them, the silent acknowledgement of shared instinct. Atlas lay beneath the table, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but his ears still moving. He had already accepted Renata in the way that working dogs accept people who carry themselves with discipline. Dogs trained in military environments develop an almost uncanny ability to read posture, breathing patterns, and micro-expressions. Atlas had read Renata and found her worthy of his company. That, in Marcus's experience, meant something. They talked around the edges of things at first. Marcus told her he had retired 8 months ago after a knee injury that ended his operational career. He told her about the transition program the Navy offered, the therapy sessions he had attended twice before deciding that talking about what happened was less useful than doing something about how he felt. He told her about buying a small house in Richmond because the city had no particular significance to him, and that felt, at the time, like a reason enough to choose it. He talked easily, not because he was a naturally open person, but because he had learned in debrief after debrief that information flows in both directions, and if you want someone to trust you, you have to give them something real to hold. Renata listened. She drank her coffee. She cut her eggs into precise, equal pieces. And then, quietly, she said, I was Army. 11 years. Got out after my second deployment because my daughter needed me home. She paused. Turns out needing me home and me actually being present were 2 different things. Marcus did not push. He recognized that particular grief, the gap between physically returning from war and emotionally arriving anywhere at all. It was the gap that swallowed veterans whole, quietly and completely, while everyone around them believed the hard part was over because the uniform was off. Where's your daughter now? He asked. Renata's jaw tightened. She looked out the window at the street where Richmond was beginning its morning routines, people walking dogs, opening storefronts, living lives that seemed to belong to a different dimension entirely. I don't know, she said. She's 23. She stopped answering my calls about 2 years ago. She turned back to Marcus then, and he saw in her eyes not self-pity but something harder and more honest. Accountability without the softness of excuse. I earned that silence, she said. I wasn't well. I made choices that a mother shouldn't make. She protected herself, and she was right to do it. The table held the weight of that for a moment. Atlas shifted beneath it, pressing slightly against Renata's leg, and she looked down at him with an expression Marcus had seen before on the faces of people who were not ready to accept comfort from another human, but could receive it from an animal without their defenses rising. She sounds like someone worth finding, Marcus said finally. Renata looked at him. Why would you care about that? Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because nobody comes home from a war and just moves on, he said. We all left something behind. The question is whether we go back for it. Marcus did not offer Renata his spare bedroom immediately. He was deliberate enough to understand that offering shelter to a stranger, regardless of the shared context of military service, required a level of trust that had to be built rather than assumed. Instead, he found her a room at the local veterans' transitional housing facility, drove her there himself, and made sure she had his phone number and enough cash to cover what the facility's modest daily fee did not include. He connected her with the Richmond chapter of a veterans service organization he had already researched during the brief time it took him to drive from the diner to the facility. He did these things efficiently and without ceremony, because efficiency and lack of ceremony were how he demonstrated respect for another person's dignity. What he did not do was disappear. He returned the next morning with Atlas, and they walked. That became their routine. Every morning, Marcus and Atlas arrived at the facility at 0630. Renata was always already outside, and they walked through the neighborhood while the city warmed up around them. They did not always talk. Sometimes they walked in the particular comfortable silence that exists between people who have both been trained to be comfortable with silence. Atlas walked between them, and his presence made the silence feel inhabited rather than empty. It was on the fourth morning that Renata talked about the deployments. Not the combat, not specifically, but the accumulation of them. The way each one took something and did not give it back. The way she had developed capabilities she never asked for and lost qualities she had never thought to protect. She talked about hypervigilance the way someone describes a chronic illness they have learned to manage rather than a wound they are still surprised by. She talked about the specific loneliness of being a female soldier in an environment that was still, during her years of service, working out how to honor her presence without fully understanding what it cost her. Marcus listened the way he had learned to listen in hostage negotiation training, which was to say fully and without preparing his response while she was still speaking. He heard in her account the same fundamental architecture that shaped his own transition experience, with differences that were real and important. Renata had faced pressures he had not. She had navigated a military culture that, while improving, still placed female soldiers in the position of having to prove not just their capability, but their right to be taken seriously at the same time. She had come home to a daughter who needed a mother and found herself able to provide physical presence, but not emotional stability. She had been diagnosed with PTSD and depression 2 years after her discharge, which was 2 years too late to prevent the cascade of consequences that followed. "The system failed you," Marcus said. "The system failed a lot of us," Renata replied without self-pity. "I also failed myself." Both things are true. That kind of clear-eyed accountability struck Marcus as something rare and genuinely admirable. He had met veterans who blamed everything external and veterans who blamed everything internal, but the ones who could hold both truths simultaneously, who could say the institution let me down and I also made choices that hurt people I loved, those were the ones who had a real chance at something better. He told her that. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she was deciding whether to believe him, which was the most honest response she could have given. It was Atlas who interrupted by suddenly sitting and pressing his flank against Renata's knee with the quiet certainty of a dog who has decided that someone needs contact. Renata put her hand on his head without thinking, and the naturalness of the gesture told Marcus more about her than anything she had yet said in words. "He likes you," Marcus said. "I like him," she said. "He doesn't ask me to explain anything." 3 weeks into their morning routine, Renata told Marcus about her daughter's name, Maya. She had named her after the poet Maya Angelou because she had read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings during her first deployment and had decided that if she ever had a daughter, she would give her a name that carried that kind of endurance inside it. Maya was 23 now, living somewhere in the Richmond area according to the last piece of information Renata had from a mutual acquaintance, working as a nursing assistant at a hospital whose name Renata did not know. She had not tried to make contact in 14 months, partly because she had been so deep in her own survival that reaching out had felt like a luxury, and partly because she believed, with the brutal honesty that had become her defining characteristic, that Maya deserved the peace of her absence. Marcus had a different perspective, and he offered it carefully, understanding that he was navigating terrain that required more care than any tactical approach he had ever planned. "Disappearing from your child's life to protect her from your pain," he said, "is a decision made from love. But it's also a decision made without her input. She might want to know you're alive. She might want the chance to decide for herself." Renata was quiet for a long time. They were sitting on a park bench, Atlas between them, the November sun doing its best against the cold. What if she says she doesn't want to see me? She finally asked. Then you honor that, Marcus said. But you give her the choice. That's the only thing you can actually give her right now. What Marcus did not tell Renata yet, because he needed to confirm it first, and because he had learned that information delivered prematurely causes more harm than it resolves, was that he had already found Maya Okafor. It had not been difficult. He had connections, a background in intelligence gathering, and the methodical patience of a man who completes tasks the way he was trained to complete them, thoroughly, quietly, and without announcement until the mission was ready to execute. Maya worked at Richmond Medical Center, third shift, and she was in the phone book under her mother's last name, which told Marcus something important. She had not changed her name, had not erased the connection entirely, and that single detail felt significant in the way that small, overlooked things often are. He called in a personal favor from a former teammate who was now a licensed private investigator and confirmed that the information was current. Then he sat with it for 4 more days, turning it over, examining it from every angle, because he understood that the moment he handed this information to Renata, something irreversible would begin. This was not the kind of operation where you could abort and return to baseline. This was someone's family. This was someone's heart. He told her on a Thursday morning, directly and without theatrical build-up, because she was not a woman who responded well to being managed. He said, I know where Maya is. He said it while they were walking, because movement makes difficult information easier to receive than stillness does. Renata stopped walking. Atlas stopped with her. She turned to Marcus and studied his face for a long moment the way experienced soldiers study terrain, looking not just at what is visible, but at what the visible elements suggest about what lies beneath. How? She asked. I have resources, he said. I use them because I believe it's worth knowing. What you do with it is entirely your decision, and I will support whatever that decision is. She looked away. Her jaw worked. Her hands, he noticed, had curled into fists at her sides, not from anger, but from the effort of holding something enormous. She's close, Renata asked. Very close, Marcus said. Renata nodded once. Then she started walking again. Atlas fell into step beside her. Marcus followed. They did not speak for the rest of the walk, but when they returned to the facility and Renata turned to say goodbye, she looked him directly in the eye and said, Thank you, Marcus, for not giving up on this. He understood she was not only talking about finding Maya. The letter took Renata 6 days to write. She wrote it by hand because she felt that the weight of it required something physical, something that could not be deleted or revised into something less true than she was willing to be. She wrote about the deployments without using them as excuses. She wrote about the PTSD diagnosis and the years she spent not understanding what was happening inside her mind and making choices from a place of dysfunction she could not then name. She wrote about the pawn shop and the bridge and Atlas pressing his head against her leg at a diner table. She wrote about Marcus without explaining him fully because some things resist summary. She told Maya that she did not expect forgiveness, that she was not writing to ask for it, that she was writing because a man with a retired military dog had reminded her that people deserve the chance to make their own choices, and that Maya deserved that chance more than anyone. Marcus read it when Renata asked him to, not to approve it, but to confirm that it sounded like her, honest, clear, and free of the performance of remorse that can sometimes make an apology more about the writer than the recipient. He said, It sounds exactly like you. Send it. She sent it through the hospital's staff mail system with a return address at the transitional housing facility. Then she waited, which is the hardest thing a soldier is ever asked to do because soldiers are trained for action and waiting feels like surrender. Marcus brought her books. Atlas brought her consistency. The Veterans Service Organization connected her with a therapist named Dr. Simone Wyatt who specialized in female veterans with complex trauma, and Renata began attending sessions twice a week with the same disciplined regularity she had once applied to physical training. What emerged from those sessions, slowly and painfully, and with the particular grace that comes from rigorous honesty, was a more complete portrait of who Renata Okafor had been and who she was becoming. She had enlisted at 19 because her family had no money for college, and she had too much ambition to accept a life defined by its limitations. She had been a natural soldier, physically capable, strategically intelligent, and possessed of a leadership quality that her first sergeant had identified in her first month of basic training. She had risen through the ranks because she was genuinely excellent, and because she refused to allow the additional weight of being a woman in a male-dominated environment to slow her down, though she privately carried that weight every single day. Her 2 deployments to Afghanistan had tested her in ways that training, comprehensive as it was, could not fully prepare a person for. She had been part of a female engagement team, one of the units designed to interact with Afghan women who could not, by cultural protocol, be approached by male soldiers. The work was important, and it was dangerous, and it required a particular kind of emotional intelligence alongside the tactical training. Because you were simultaneously a warrior and a human bridge between cultures, and holding both of those identities at once was a specific kind of exhausting that did not resolve when the mission ended. She came home the second time not broken. She was insistent on that word, but fundamentally changed in ways she did not yet have the language or support to understand. Her daughter was 9 years old and needed a mother who was fully present. And Renata did not know how to be present in the ways that mattered while she was still fighting an invisible continuation of a war that had technically ended. She had needed help. She had not gotten it in time. That was the truth, unadorned and complete. Maya's response arrived 17 days after the letter was sent. It was a single page, handwritten on paper that smelled faintly of the hospital where she worked. It said, "I have been waiting for you to come back from wherever you went. I never stopped. Can we talk?" Renata sat in Dr. Wyatt's office when she read it, which was not planned but turned out to be exactly right. She did not cry immediately. She held the letter and breathed in and out 4 times, the tactical breathing technique she had learned in the army for maintaining composure under extreme stress. And then she cried in the way that people cry when something they had stopped believing in returns to them against all odds. The meeting between Renata and Maya happened on a Saturday afternoon in December at a small coffee shop in the Churchill neighborhood of Richmond. Marcus drove Renata there because she asked him to, and he waited outside with Atlas because she needed him close but needed the conversation itself to be private. He sat on a bench in the cold with his dog and drank coffee from a thermos and did not check his watch because this was not his timeline to manage. Maya Okafor was tall and carried herself with the particular upright posture of someone who had grown up watching a soldier mother move through the world. She arrived 3 minutes early, which told Marcus something before she even went inside. She looked at him and Atlas on her way in, paused, and said quietly, "Are you Marcus?" He said yes. She nodded, the same single, deliberate nod her mother used, and said, "Thank you," before pushing open the door. They were inside for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Marcus knew because Atlas eventually fell asleep across his feet, and he had to keep still so as not to wake him, and stillness creates a particular awareness of time's passage. He did not try to imagine what they were saying. He understood that some conversations are not his to construct, only to make possible, and that his role in this story had never been to be its center, but to be the hinge on which a door could swing open. What Renata told him later was that Maya had grown into someone extraordinary, thoughtful, clear-eyed, already building a life grounded in service, already studying at night for her registered nursing exam. She had inherited her mother's discipline and her mother's intelligence, and, it turned out, her mother's precise and unsentimental honesty, which made the conversation between them hard and real in all the ways that mattered. They had not solved everything. Renata did not pretend to him that a 2-hour conversation could dissolve years of accumulated absence, but they had begun. A beginning, she said, was enough to work with. Marcus moved Renata from the transitional facility into his spare bedroom in January, with clear and mutual agreements about temporary duration, personal boundaries, and the specific goal of helping her achieve financial independence through veteran benefits she had not previously accessed and employment through a veteran workforce integration program he had, researched with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He did this not from pity and not from romance. Their relationship was something different, something more rare. The bond between 2 people who have looked at each other's worst reality and chosen to stand beside it anyway. He did it because he believed, with the evidence-based certainty of a man who had spent his career assessing what was real and what was possible, that Renata Okafor was one of the most resilient human beings he had ever encountered, and that resilience, given the right conditions, does not merely survive. It transforms. It leads. It teaches. And he understood, in the particular way that service teaches you to understand things that are larger than yourself, that helping her find her footing was not charity. It was the extension of a value system he had built his entire adult life around. You do not leave people behind. Not on the battlefield. Not on a bridge beneath a highway overpass. Not when the cost of reaching back is nothing more than your own comfort and your own time. Atlas seemed to agree. He had taken to sleeping in the hallway between their two rooms, equidistant, like a compass needle that had found true north and was content to rest there.